It's really great to have you all here. I'd like to introduce Colin Currie, who's here for our live Q&A session today. I'm sure you're all aware that Colin is a highly successful, world-renowned percussionist, best known for his solo performances and work with the Colin Currie Quartet and Colin Currie Group. In particular, today we're going to ask questions and discuss his work with the Colin Currie Group. So let's just get started. Why did you form a group specifically to perform the works of Steve Reich? What inspired you so much about his compositions in particular?
Well, this was one of those things that I think might be informative for today's session, because I think it shows how projects can come alive, and that's the virtue of making the best of opportunities that come your way, really. And also how anything that you may devote yourself to is, or perhaps has to be born of love of the art form, or love of a certain type of music, or in this case, a composer. So in this instance, Steve Reich, I was a huge fan of his music from very early on in my musical sort of discoveries, I suppose. Probably first knew his music when I was 12 or 13. I suppose the first piece of his that I would have played would probably have been clapping music. Probably played all wrong and backwards and terrible, but at least having a first stab at a piece like that from an age along those lines. And then, one goes about one's studies, and he was always on my radar, and going through college, I'd gotten to know pieces like Music for 18 Musicians. And at that time, these were these sort of huge pieces, but they were still kind of pie in the sky. And I never would know how I could possibly get involved in a piece of music like that. So that goes back to the mid-90s when I was studying Royal Academy. And then, things moved and developed for me. And in 2006, the BBC Proms approached me about curating a concert for Steve's 70th birthday. Sorry, 60th birthday. It's all very confusing to get it right. 2006, 16. I decided that I would devote that particular occasion to having a stab at drumming. Now, drumming was the piece that I understood the least of perhaps his entire output, and it really was an opportunity to assemble these very good friends of mine and have a crack at this piece. And that's what happened. We did clapping music, Nagoya marimbas, music from out instruments, voices, and organ, and we ended up with this performance of drumming. And because I was blessed with these great colleagues of mine, these friends of mine who are still in the group, people like Sam Walton, Eddie Spillett, Owen, and some others, it just seemed like a really good opportunity to put things together and really try and make something of this. So it was a slow process, but it began with one event. And from that one event, I decided to push things on.
Cool, that's great. Are there any specific techniques which you have to consider and develop to perform this particular type of music successfully?
I think the main thing for us, it sounds a little fine to say that, but I think we do all feel the same way about the music, is that it's chamber music of the most deep kind. So it really does, the music lends itself to all kinds of nuance. And I think the performance practice of Steve's music in the past, and maybe depending on where it's done now in certain circles, it's a little too absorbed with the accuracy that is required for the music. There's no doubt about that. I mean, an inaccurate performance of Steve's music is never going to be enjoyable. But there's a lot to get past that. I mean, beyond the sort of metronomic quality that the music can have, not always, but it can have. There's a whole world of coloristic possibilities and things to do with balance and things to do with dynamics. I mean, when we play drumming, the dynamic range is huge. I mean, it goes from sort of blow the roof off, but right the way down to extremely delicate and everything in between. And we go for long builds and we do lots of things with mallets and colors. And so our approach is very much on the chamber music side of things, if I can say that.
Yeah. How has your relationship with Steve himself affected your performance of his music?
Well, it's been great. It's been very informative. I mean, remember the first time I met him in 2011, I was very nervous because he came to hear us play drumming, and I knew that we played it differently to certainly the version that he had recorded with his group, and I knew it was different to quite a lot of versions out there. And although I kind of stuck by or felt quite confident with the version that we had, I knew that perhaps he might take him by surprise, or indeed very likely there would be things in there that he wouldn't agree with or maybe even dislike. But fortunately, the reverse was true. Insofar as he was very, very surprised and I think really overjoyed, actually, if I may, with the concert. But it did also shock him, and he didn't really know that certain parts of the piece could sound that way. And I think it kind of tickles him to know that there are these different paths, these very divergent and diverse paths, so different ways of performing his music. And ours is only one way of many, of course, but it's the way we like to do it. And he's also he's known for being very demanding, and I absolutely really like that in someone. I mean, there's no point in you have to speak your mind in these kinds of situations, and he's just very direct, and sometimes he has to tell us, no, that won't work, please do it this way. But he's always very courteous, he's always very understanding, he's always very reasonable. And the pressures are often quite tight, things like time, rehearsal time is always very difficult for the group. And he's very supportive, very understanding, but he's also there to give comment and assistance, and also moral support. He's great backstage. He likes hanging out with the gang, and he likes to have a laugh and have a drink with us afterwards. And we get a lot from all that. He's very generous with his time.
It must be very different working in an ensemble compared to when you work as a soloist. Can you talk us through some of the differences sort of in mindset and rehearsal that you have when you go through the different types of playing?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I enjoy doing the ensemble work is that it's not my comfort zone. So if you want me to be comfortable, put me in front of an orchestra. That's where I feel most relaxed, most capable, and most experienced. So put me in a chamber ensemble, and I'm immediately in a situation where I feel that I'm having to learn as quickly, or maybe even more quickly, than anybody else there. And that's absolutely great. And I think that's what musicians should do, is as soon as you go out of that comfort zone, you're able to have these fantastic experiences. I mean, it's great to take that risk in music. So that's one of the reasons I enjoy it, is that it's that challenge for me. And the skills, of course, are very different. As a soloist, I feel pretty clear with what I have to do. I'm usually spearheading the musical endeavor, not always, but I'm often riding high on it. But in the chamber ensemble, it's much more about blend and making sure everything fits and you're making the right sound and being really equal amongst your colleagues. And that's also, of course, a very edifying and beautiful way to make music that's not available to soloists. And I think you'll find a lot of soloists really enjoy kicking back and playing chamber music. My string player friends who are soloists, they all love to jump into a Mendelssohn octet, any opportunity. So it's a bit like that.
Cool. And in all of your ensemble, specifically your recordings and performances, your ensemble is always, completely tight and together. And obviously the Steve Reich pieces, rhythmically it's quite difficult, and the repetition, sort of knowing where you are. Is there any specific rehearsal techniques that you use, or can you walk us through just a typical rehearsal of a piece like that?
Well, we've been lucky with the pieces that the group have taken on into our repertoire. A piece like drumming, initially there was a rehearsal period. So for drumming, and I must correct myself, actually, the event in 2006 was for Steve's 70th birthday. I get very confused with his birthday because he seems so young to me, and it's so amazing that he was born in 1936, and he looks. And it's only until you get very, very close to him that he looks anything other than about 50. So forgive me for getting my dates mixed up. But in 2006, when we first did drumming, we were given an initial period to rehearse the work. And we've relied on such things always as we've gone about our business. Every time we've learned a new piece, there's always been a promoter to support our ensemble. The first time we did music for 18 musicians, that was supported by the South Bank Centre. The first time we did Tehelim was in Japan, and we had a rehearsal period in Tokyo. So it's tough. Rehearsal techniques. I've got a you got to understand, I've got a very, very good team. So everyone arrives, everyone knows the piece backwards. I mean, if the music stand blew over, they probably keep playing and play to the end of the work. A lot of them. Everyone's very sharp, everyone's very practical. And although we have a great time, when we're rehearsing, it's almost like this shutter comes down and everyone behaves very practically, very respectfully. And I think those things are very, very important. And as much fun as we have in the gigs and, afterwards, if we go out and all that kind of thing, it's just that sort of respect and that focus and knowing questions that should be asked and questions that you can maybe keep to yourself to sort out in your own time. And the mistake that people can make is that absolutely awful thing of turning up and using an ensemble's time for your own personal practice. That's something that's just, there's no time for that. I mean, occasionally you see that maybe in a less experienced setting, some will turn up, not really have their thing together, and after a few minutes, you can see that they're slowing things up and kind of just practicing on the company time. That's a real no-no. So we tend to avoid that.
Do you have any upcoming projects during lockdown, and how have you had to adapt? Obviously, everything's different now. You're rehearsing and performance in a difficult time. How are you still managing to keep going with your playing?
Yeah, well, it's been a combination of things. Last year was excruciating. I lost a lot of concerts and world premieres. I think I counted, it was 3 concerto premieres had to be forfeited, which was very galling, because these were pieces that I should have been playing in premiere, but also repeatedly as the season and the next season goes on. So the first thing I did was I finished my homework with these pieces. So although they weren't learnt when lockdown began, I decided I would finish learning these works. So they were 3 pieces. Luc Bedford, Bruno Mantovani, and Philippe Hurel were all works that were new to me. It included 2 world premieres, and they're all substantial pieces. So I ended up preparing them to a high level, and that was good kind of use of the time to begin with. Then it got a little trickier. I was unsure about recording things at home. I had an initial approach from the Percussive Arts Society to do an event for them at their international convention, where I'd never been. So that was attractive, because I'd never made a contribution to them, and I wanted to perhaps be part of that and stick my toe in the water, even though it was obviously not in person. And they spoke to me and they said, "Oh, you know, you'll be fine. You just get this camera, that microphone, da, 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 da." And I just thought, no, that's just not going to happen. So I ended up finding a local firm here in Glasgow, and they were excellent, really, really good. And so I did a kind of a tryout with them, and they recorded this solo recital for PASIC. That was very good. And so I used them again to record a concert film with my quartet, also here in this room, actually. And that was for a concert promoter in Hong Kong. So there's been a couple of things happening at home. And I've also been on the road a little bit. I mean, in the autumn, I managed to hold on to a number of events. I was able to get out to Sweden, Finland, Poland, and I also did a solo recital here in Glasgow for the BBC. So it's a much less positive picture now, sadly. The travel restrictions are really getting tough. So yeah, just trying to also do what I can on the educational side of things, try and stay connected. It's a challenge for everyone. It's not easy, and of course I miss playing with orchestras terribly. I mean, I've been so used to it, been very, very lucky with that, perhaps you could say, but certainly at this point it's pretty agonizing to not be surrounded by a symphony orchestra, because that's really where I sort of find my happiest place. But you know, fingers crossed for the return of that.
Yeah, so I've got one more question, and after I ask this question, I'm going to open up the floor to the students on the call to ask some questions. If you do have a question, can you click the raise hand button on your Zoom box, and then we'll choose someone and we'll unmute you and you can ask Colin your question. If you're watching live on Facebook, feel free to put your questions in the comments and we'll try and get through as many as possible. But my last question is that on the day of a performance, do you have a routine or any tips for being as mentally and physically prepared as possible?
Yeah, I really try and empty my head out. I mean, the cliches start to flood in at this point, but the whole business about leaving your head behind and walking on stage with your heart, I mean, that's kind of the truest one that there is. And that's maybe why it's a cliche, because actually there's a lot to that. Concert day, get physically loose. I mean, when I'm doing the concertos, I always ask for this, what I call my pre-match, which is just a warm up, and it's usually 90 minutes. So you'll usually see me on stage, and I ask for it to be as close as possible to the doors opening, because of course, for most concerto soloists, they're able to go backstage and keep the tricky riffs hot in their dressing room, but that's not an option for me. So I like to warm up as close as possible to doors opening, usually about 90 minutes, and usually pretty slow. Don't really do any of the fast licks at speed, and just get nice and loose. And then it's performance time. So you have to let it hang. I mean, no one wants to hear a careful soloist. I've never heard one that's been enjoyable. So you have to take that risk. That's part of the musical contract. That's really speaking as a soloist. It's very, very different when you're in an ensemble and in an orchestra section, I would say. But mentally, just try and another cliche, free your mind, or preferably leave it in the dressing room. You can catch up your head later, and on stage, just hand it over to the preparation. If you've done your hours, which are not really hours, they're actually years of practice, then it will come out of your horn. Come prepared and leave your heat in the dressing room.
That's great, thanks so much. So has anyone got any questions? If you could raise your hand on the Zoom box and we can unmute you. Tom Hall.
Hi, sorry, just trying to figure out how to raise the hand button there. Hi Colin, nice to see Tom. You over Zoom. It's great to have you here. I've got a question. I know that you've worked closely with James MacMillan, composer, for the percussion concerto in 2014, I believe. It'd be great to hear some more about that and how that came about. I know he wrote concerto for Evelyn previously. So a lot of Scots about, so it'd be great to hear about that.
Yeah, well, Jimmy, if I may call him that, I met him when I was 13. So again, I have to do my maths with the years, but that's more than 30 years ago. And he, at that time, he was just finishing Veni Veni Emmanuel. And interestingly, I actually recall, because he was my composition teacher for a couple of years. Didn't get weekly lessons with him, but I got a few lessons with him. I remember one week I brought him a piece that I'd written, a set of variations for flute and vibraphone. And he said to me, "Oh, that's interesting. I've just finished a section in my percussion concerto that's a duet for flute and vibraphone. And it's that dance 2 in Veni Veni Emmanuel." So little did I know. And then I because I grew up in Edinburgh, I attended what was in fact the second ever performance of the concerto. The world premiere was at the BBC Proms, and then the next day or similar, they repeated it at the Edinburgh Festival, and I was there, and it was incredibly inspiring because of the power of the music and the wonderful kind of emancipation of the percussion instruments, and I was just so inspired by this sort of majestic piece that I made it one of my ambitions to perform it one day. So I got my first chance to do so 3 or 4 years later. And then for a while, I would perform Veni Veni with Jimmy conducting. And I guess in sort of 2010, 11, 12, we were actually working together rather a lot on the piece, and we'd play the concerto and we'd go out for dinner afterwards, and there'd be a presenter there, and the presenter would say, "So, are you going to write another concerto now?" And everyone would kind of laugh, like ha 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 ha. And then eventually one night we're in Sweden, and we went to the bar afterwards, and I said, "So, are you going to write me another concerto like this?" And then he said, "Oh yeah, absolutely. I think the time might be right." And then he started speaking immediately about a very different piece, which it is. It's exceedingly different. First of all, it's a symphonic piece. Veni Veni Emmanuel is, I think, very much a piece for those original forces. I like playing it best with the smaller orchestra, 86442 in the strings. Whereas JM2, as we call it, the piece he wrote me, really is the bigger the better. I mean, it's a large symphony orchestra, huge parts for the brass. There are 2 percussionists in the orchestra, timps, piano, harp. It's a real, it's a big symphonic piece, and the atmosphere of the music is very, very different. There's dissonant harmonic language in there for sure, but it's actually it's kind of more of it's a slightly brighter piece, slightly lighter. It's a little more upbeat, I would say. Veni Veni Emmanuel is very brooding, whereas JM2 is a little more. It's an upper, not a downer. So it's been wonderful. I mean, I love playing both the pieces. I'm hoping one day I could play them both in a single concert somewhere. And Jimmy's a fine friend. I actually live quite close to him now, and he's one of the few people that I've seen a little bit in the last 12 months. Wonderful man and excellent composer.
Thanks for that, Tom. Harriet Kwong, if you've got a question.
Hi, Colin. Very nice to hear from you. I know you have done quite a lot of commission and premiere many works by those famous composer. If you have to choose one, which one is the funniest and the challenging one you have ever done?
Well, I mean, it's not a question that I could answer. Most soloists, if they were asked what's your favorite concerto, they would probably say whatever concerto is they're playing that week, which I think is always the right answer. I mean, there've been so many. I mean, I would not be able to remember all the concertos, and so many deeply profound pieces, special pieces, now linked with great memories. Maybe also composers who are no longer with us. If you look at concertos like Rautavaara, Incantations, Enu Juhani, is no longer with us, so great memories of being with him before he died. The same with Elliot Carter. He wrote me one of his final works was this concerto that I approached him about, a double concerto for piano, percussion, and chamber orchestra. So extraordinary memories of being with Elliot when he was 103 years old, and inspiration to all of us. Sharp as a tack, composing, enjoying life, enjoying music, enjoying composing, making jokes, hilarious, amazing. Louis Andriessen, who sadly now is also not keeping so well, and has written what they now say will be his final published work. So I think those elder statesmen are very, very important to me. I couldn't pick a single piece. The younger composers such as Dave Marek and Joe Dedell, I think they always have a special place for me. Not only the quantity of music they've written for me, which is, you know, in Dave's case, more than a dozen premieres, but I think a very special kind of new wave of percussion music that's been very, very important and picked up by a lot of other people. Kalevi Aho, that concerto is extremely special to me. And I'm very, very proud of if I may, proud of my new recording of that work, which just came out on BIS, which was recorded just a couple of weeks before the pandemic hit. So it's a slightly remarkable recording that sits right on the precipice of everything sort of vanishing. So I could never pick, but it's a wonderful collection of pieces, and I'm very proud of them.
Cool. Thanks, Harriet. Callum Montgomery.
Hi. So my question is, obviously lockdown's hit, all gigs are off. How are you sort of staying motivated to practice at and maintain your high level when really like you said, you sort of hit the pandemic, you just released a CD and nothing sort of happening? How have you continued to stay motivated, a year later?
Yeah, it's been tricky. And I mean, I have also taken a considerable amount of time off. That has been part of this. But in my case, it was almost possible to make a virtue of that, having not had a long breather like that at any point. So, I mean, I will be honest, and I have no problem admitting that to anyone, that I also took a 7-week break, didn't touch a mallet, and just caught up on hanging out on the sofa and reading and whatever else, sleeping a lot. But to keep motivated, yeah, I mean, you know it yourself when you got things to work on. I've been very lucky last year with my quartet, with Sam, Eddie and Owen. We had the most unlikely of events on the books in Vilnius in Lithuania in October. Just mad concert with 6 pieces that were new to us. So like a whole new program really. Very challenging stuff. And it actually held. We actually made it to Vilnius, and it was this whole debacle. It was inspiring. It was challenging. It was emotional. It was hilarious. It was all these things. So I think I was lucky to find a smaller project with these guys who I'm very close to, and that was very useful because it also gave me a lot of things to think about in my playing, and in particular with one of the pieces by Andy Akiho. There's this technique in there where I'm playing the we all play with these timbali sticks. So it's this piece, Pillar 4. And I play mostly vibraphone with it. And there's a bit at the end, which is a lot of doubles. So on a technical level, a lot of doubles in the hands. And normally I could probably rattle that off very easily, but there was something about it with these timbali sticks on the vibraphone was really strange for the chops. It was kind of wasn't here, it wasn't there, it wasn't, it was very difficult to get this thing working right. So it was a interesting challenge because it was something that I would never imagine struggling with, but all of a sudden I felt completely ham-fisted with this thing. So it's quite an interesting challenge. So I think, going back to what I said, you know when you need to work on something, and that's when you get to work, and you take your time and you work with the metronome, and I've managed to stay motivated that way. But I'm very grateful to the project with the quartet. That's been one of the main things.
Thank you, Callum. The next question we've got comes from someone watching live on Facebook. It's from Jacob Griffith, and he says, do you have any advice for programming solo recitals?
Yes, I do. Planning solo recitals is extremely tough. I actually, for many years, didn't have one under my belt. And I felt kind of embarrassed, shy about it almost, because I was going around, and every city I would go to, especially in the States, I would usually give a master class, and everyone was coming up and playing solo marimba to me, and I would be there supposedly pontificating on the subject. But I had really wound up playing almost exclusively concertos, and anyone can sound good standing in front of the Cleveland Orchestra. So I wanted to address this, and I made a new recital program in 2014, and I looked at it very carefully. I would still say perhaps a little bit, I don't know, maybe it's not what you want to hear, or maybe it's a little bit controversial, but the repertoire for the genuinely unaccompanied solo percussionist is still, it's a couple of masterpieces short of a art gallery, or whatever you want to say. It's hard to find a recital that has that enough diversity without becoming just a grab bag. So you want to program a recital that makes sense when you run it start to finish, but at the same time, you need to have a mixture in there. Marimba works, multiple percussion works, something that's quite straightforward for the audience, something that's a little bit challenging. You want a soft piece, you want a loud piece. You got to think of it this way, and yet somehow you can't have it it can't just be a mishmash. So I made a recital that I call it's not over long, my recital, which I think is also key. Don't make your recital too long. It's really deathly. It's only 90 minutes of music, and there's an interval as well. Sorry, it's a 90-minute event, and that includes an interval. So it's about 70 minutes of music. And I call it my medicine sugar cube recital. So I actually played it at the Royal Northern, I think in 2016. So that's maybe before a lot of you were there. And the first half is quite a lot for the listener to take in. And I play it without a break. So it's half an hour of music. And it's a lot to take on board. But the second half is kind of a release from that. I also speak to the audience. So the first half, we just hit them with this, very sort of strong stuff. Second half, more relaxed, try and get a couple of gags in there. Medicine, sugar cube, it's tried and tested. But the real key is to plan a recital that flows, but yet has that diversity.
Thanks, that's great. Thank you, Jacob. Next, Oscar Williams.
Hi, Colin.
Hi.
I was watching your performance of the Rotovaro concerto back in 2016. I think with the Helsinki Orchestra.
Oh yeah.
And I was amazed by the cadenza that you did, and I was wondering, how do you create such kind of intricate cadenzas, and how do you change them depending on what kind of composer and what kind of style the piece is?
Yeah, well, there's been a couple of occasions where I've really, I would say, written cadenzas for concertos, and they happen in very different ways. The first one was the Jennifer Higdon concerto, where there's just a bar that just says, and it just has a pause over it, and it's after a kind of percussion break between me and the back of the orchestra, and it just says percussion improvise. It's very sort of just plugged in instruction, which I think is really smart, because it really frees the soloist up. That that's very little information. But I think that's quite clever in a way. It gives maximum sort of freedom to take full reign there. So in the Higden, just briefly about the Higden, because it did inform how I wrote the Rautavaara concerto. I really wanted to make it seamless from Jennifer's music into this cadenza, and just to give her music and her material a sort of fourth dimension, just briefly for that cadenza. And so using her material, I made it into this, what I thought was needed at that time in the piece was a kind of slightly showy, slightly up-tempo, energetic kind of expansion of the material that she'd already provided in the piece. So there's nothing in there that you haven't heard before, but it's as if it's been given new arms and legs behind the drums. And then I tailor-made it also back into her material so that when the cadenza ends, there's no break. It just goes immediately back into the orchestra. And the great thing about it is no one even knows. I mean, that I wrote it. If you heard a performance of it, you would just think that Jennifer had her percussion head together that day. And I think that's what I wanted for that piece. And so it was with the Rautavaara. He also asked me about writing the cadenza for his piece because apparently Richard Saltzman had written the cadenza for the clarinet concerto when that work was premiered. And so I immediately said yes. Good at saying yes and sort of leaving myself with interesting riddles to solve. And in his case, it was different because in Jennifer's work was very much a drum thing. This was obviously only about pitches, mallet instruments. So the ante, it was very high. I think it was something that really I couldn't just. For example, the Jennifer cadenza I just threw together over the course of an afternoon. But this cadenza for Rautavaara, I remember it took me more than 2 weeks to write it. And what I did was I just started improvising around the instruments. This is marimba, vibraphone with the pedal held down, and 2 octaves of crotales. I started just improvising with his material. And what I knew I wanted was to have a lot of sound. So that's why I had this weight on the vibraphone pedal and a lot of resonant things in the crotales so that I could have a lot of things ringing. Because one of the problems with the percussion is that everything dies. You hit something and it's, or a drum or a block, it's dead in the water, you know. And I just wanted this cadenza to be kind of sonorous. And so that's what I did. And I made the cadenza into, it's a bit like a sort of 2-minute version of the whole piece. And it blows through a lot of his material, uses his harmonies. And then at the end, I wrote this slightly weird chorale, which is the only original bit of music from me in the whole piece. And although in that chorale, there's no Rautavaara material, it's very definitely his harmonies. So a lot of melodies and clusters and dissonances, especially things like intervals like minor ninths. So at the end is a kind of final paying of respects from me to him. It's me really allowing myself, I hope as humbly as possible, to write my own little piece of music after his style, and then the piece recapitulates with the coda to finish. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I was amazed recently to hear a recording of the work by another percussionist. And indeed, he had completely appropriated my cadenza. He plays it note for note. He plays it very, very well. He plays it quite differently to me, but you know, spot on. And it seems that this cadenza, I mean, it is published, but it certainly still opens. Someone could play their own cadenza in there for sure. But I think other people playing that piece have taken this cadenza on. Yeah.
Thanks, Oscar. Emilio Yanez Ruiz, have you got a question next?
Oh, Colin, thank you. Yeah, so my question is quite related to the previous one. I'm a composer, and I'd like to ask you about your experience with composers, but also composing yourself. Sometimes it's difficult to like get together the material we are working on, like perhaps it's a groove or some kind of rhythm that feels really natural when playing it, but then in the score it might look difficult, or maybe it takes like a lot of bars to get an idea that can be simple. So would you recommend to have like a base of the group you're playing with instead of trying to write it down like at the beginning, sort of?
Well, I mean, it depends what type of music you're doing. I think it's instructive to think of Steve Reich and the way he worked with his group. I mean, the pieces drumming and music for 80 musicians, those pieces were not written down at all until much later, much later. So those pieces were all learnt by ear and by rote. And of course, it was proved quite a challenge to find a way to commit those pieces to score. So it depends I don't know anything about your music, of course, at the moment, but it depends what type of music you're writing. But I think it is important if there is rhythmic complexity in a piece, it is important to give your group or yourself enough experience to allow that to come out in a way that is not as foreboding as it maybe looks on the page, whether it's Brian Ferneyhough or Steve Reich. I recently played a very good piece by Tansy Davies called Dark Ground, which is essentially a groove piece. But on the page, it looks like a Boulez piece at times, but it's really a groove piece. And when you play it, it sounds kind of dark and groovy and kind of interesting and weird, and it just doesn't sound especially overly complex, although it sounds rich. So yeah, it's very important to give your ensemble enough time to learn whatever rhythms or patterns may be on the page. It's a tricky one. It takes time.
Thanks, Emilio. Cheng, we have your question next, please.
Okay. Hi, Colin. My question is, sometimes I will feel nervous before the performance and will affect my performance. So I want to know how to solve the problem, how to solve the problem from the nervous.
Yeah, well, it's good that, first of all, it's good that you get nervous, okay? It's the essential part of performing, and that's what makes performing exciting, and it's what also makes good performances, okay? I've never played a memorable performance when I wasn't nervous. I've never done that, no experience of that. So it's good that you're talking about it, and it's good that you don't, I mean, one should never ignore this. I see nerves as a contributing factor to music making. It's not a negative, it's part of the whole experience. And because you will give many concerts in your life, some experiences will be good and some will be less good, and there'll be everything in the middle. But with nerves, it's important to maybe look at it a slightly different way. First of all, I tend to take away that word itself, because it seems it's quite a negative word in some way, this idea of being nervous as a phrase, in the English language at least. It's one that I don't necessarily want to work with. So you could call it anything else. You could call it excitement, you could call it edge, you could call it Fred, you can call it anything. But the important is that you get close with it. I think like anything like that in life, you kind of make friends with it. Get close to that feeling, embrace it, and remember that it's essentially adrenaline. And in the animal kingdom, and probably for us too, I would say, adrenaline is released into your system to make you more alert and quicker and able to perform at a higher level. Athletes need it. I mean, an athlete performing without Fred is never going to win that race. So it's good to embrace it. It's good to know that you have to work with it and make friends with it. I've been through everything with nerves. It used to be incredibly, backstage, I would worry if I could even play one note in a concerto and then go on and play just fine. So I've had those times that have been very worrying, and you just push through them. And it's the experience of repeatedly having to perform in different places, different types of music, different settings, front of the orchestra, back of the orchestra, ensemble, everything feeds in. It's like watering a plant. So the more experience you have, these feelings that you have will become closer to you, and you'll be able to use them positively. It takes time, there's ups, there's downs, but there's no doubt that you get on better with Fred as time goes on.
Thanks, Ching. We'll have one more question, and it'll be from Stefan Burton.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, maybe it's a bit specific, I don't know, but you've been playing in many different halls and venues and places. Do you actually make adjustments before playing with the acoustics, I mean?
It's actually a very, very good question. And I blow hot and cold on this one, and I don't think I have my own answer. Certainly preparing a concert, a concerto, as a percussionist, I will have my mallets all chosen in advance. And I'll be honest, that does tend to mean that piece has those mallets. So that as I go around all these, could be very different halls, I have the same mallets because they're the ones that are comfortable. They're really making the right sounds, probably for a variety of settings, but maybe not for every single setting, it's true. But especially what I found working with the group and the quartet is that sometimes we do have to make decisions about mallets on the day and in a hall. And, you know, I got to say, there's that rule of thumb is if you're in doubt that the mallet isn't hard enough, it's not hard enough. That's especially true for the marimba and the vibraphone. You know, if you're there and you're thinking, I wonder if this mallet's hard. It's no, even if you're already thinking of it, just get those harder mallets out. Sorry, I mean, it's not always our favorite sound, but in big halls and with orchestras around you, often in concertos, you just need to start wailing. So yeah, that's an ongoing question for myself that you raise. I mean, I think you have to draw the line. I mean, I don't think you can completely rethink a recital just because you've gone into a new acoustic. I think at a certain point, as a percussionist, your mallet choice is your sound. So if you're using a completely different set of mallets, depending on the hall, you're completely changing your whole artistry. So you will sound different in different halls. So I think that's also very acceptable. And it's also interesting. I mean, especially in the solo recital, I've played it in halls that have been extremely dead, and I've walked off stage at the end and felt like, you know, giving up. And then 2 nights later, I'll play it in a lovely hall with that blossom and bloom, and you know, I've felt completely invincible. So, and using the same mallets. So you're really at the mercy of the acoustic a lot of the time. Prepare your sound as you think is appropriate. If you're making a sound that you're confident with and it's articulate enough, just watch that as a golden rule. Then, yeah, go with that. Be prepared to maybe have some harder mallets with you. But again, it's a practical thing. You can't go around carrying a completely different set of mallets just in case the acoustic is going to be a problem. So be prepared, be smart, and especially with the concertos, you may have to err on the side of harder mallets, truly. Because believe it or not, it's the strings that cover you.
Thanks, Stefan. That's great. Thank you, Colin, so much for your time this afternoon. Before we wrap up, do you have any final advice for everyone watching and listening today?
Oh, that's That's a question. Well, I think, yeah, again, cliches, I'm afraid, sort of come out. I mean, studying music, your work is never done. You know, I'm still at it here, practicing every day, and I think knowing how to practice and being your own best critic is the best way in music. Being rigorous in your preparation, not being too hard on yourself at the same time. There's got to be a balance there. But practice well and give yourself also that headspace. I think everything that's happened in the past 12 months or so, moving forward, there are fewer events going on. We used to dash around with these crazy schedules. And I think a lot of musicians are nervous about the idea of having to get back to that one day, and how on earth will we ever manage, you know? But I think give yourself also that bit of headspace, go for that walk, you know, zone out into that meditative place, that whole kind of well-being side of life is extremely important, and it will help you. So practice hard, you know, push yourself, be hard on yourself, not overly hard, but hard enough, and try and give yourself also that breathing space to just kind of shake it out and be an open-minded person. That's a very important thing with music, to combine all the sort of hours alone in the practice room with being someone who is able to look up and out as well.
Great, thank you. I'm sure everyone will join me in saying a huge thanks to Colin for being here today to answer our questions. And thanks to everyone who contributed, everyone watching on Facebook and everyone here. So yeah, thank you so much.